The hum of the airport was a chaotic symphony. Boarding calls crackled over the speakers, luggage wheels rattled across polished floors, and the murmurs of travelers blended into a rhythmic buzz of anticipation. Amidst the movement, two figures stood still, gripping their first-class tickets tightly. Daniel Brooks adjusted the strap of his backpack, his fingers pressing into the material, as if grounding himself in the reality of the moment. This wasn't something they were used to. Business class, a world of silent luxury and effortless indulgence. His sister, Sienna, stood beside him, shifting her weight from foot to foot, eyes flickering between the departure screen and the glass wall that overlooked the runway. She was barely containing her excitement, her hands smoothing the edges of her sweater as she exhaled, her breath misting slightly against the cool air of the terminal. "Can you believe this?" she whispered, her voice brimming with wonder. Daniel only gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. He wasn't the type to let excitement show easily, but inside there was a quiet hum of satisfaction. Their father, Michael Brooks, had arranged everything, a surprise that had made Sienna nearly jump out of her seat when she found out. Their father wasn't with them on this flight, but his presence lingered in the details. The effortless way their seats had been secured, the way the check-in staff had processed their tickets without question. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal, and they moved toward the gate. The flight attendant barely glanced at them as she scanned their passes and waved them through. But as they stepped into the aircraft, the energy shifted. Sienna inhaled sharply, her gaze sweeping over the cabin. The contrast was striking. The first-class section exuded a quiet exclusivity. Spacious leather seats, soft lighting, the scent of something expensive lingering in the air. A stark difference from the cramped economy seats they were used to. She trailed her fingers along the armrest as she took her seat, the smoothness of the material foreign under her touch. Daniel took the window seat, adjusting his watch as he settled in. He felt the weight of his sister's gaze and turned slightly, raising an eyebrow. "You're acting like you've never seen a plane before," he muttered, though there was no real bite to his words. Sienna huffed, nudging him with her foot. "Not like this. Look at this legroom." She stretched out, a grin playing at her lips. "And the seats actually recline." Daniel smirked but didn't respond. Instead, he let his gaze drift, observing the other passengers. Suits, polished shoes, subtle but expensive jewelry. The kind of people who belonged here. The kind who wouldn't be surprised by an upgrade. A few rows ahead, a flight attendant moved with the practiced elegance of someone who knew the weight of her authority. Her uniform was pristine, not a wrinkle in sight, her blonde hair neatly secured into a flawless twist. Samantha Warren. There was something about her posture, rigid, controlled. She was making her way through the cabin, checking seat numbers, her gaze lingering just a fraction of a second longer on some passengers than others. Then as she approached their row, she slowed. Her eyes flickered over them, her professional smile faltering for the briefest moment, a shift so subtle that most wouldn't have noticed. But Daniel did. Sienna, still basking in the glow of their unexpected luxury, didn't register the scrutiny. But Daniel felt it. The quiet assessment, the hesitation. Samantha stopped beside them, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of a seat as she leaned in slightly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" Daniel met her gaze without hesitation, pulling out his ticket and handing it to her. "Pretty sure," he said evenly. There was a moment of silence as she scanned the details, her grip tightening slightly around the paper. The smile she had worn moments ago was now replaced by something more restrained, a carefully composed neutrality. "This is first class," she stated. Daniel nodded. "We know." Sienna, finally sensing the shift in atmosphere, glanced up. Her excitement dimmed slightly as she noticed the unreadable expression on the flight attendant's face. "Who booked these seats for you?" Samantha's tone remained even, but there was something underneath it, a quiet edge, a note of doubt that wasn't present when she addressed the other passengers. Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling Sienna shift beside him. "Our father," he answered. Another pause, a fraction of a second too long. Then with a sharp nod, Samantha handed back the tickets. "Enjoy your flight," she said, before turning on her heel and walking away, her posture a little stiffer than before. Sienna leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. That was weird. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't say anything, but the weight of the interaction lingered. It wasn't the question itself, it was the way it had been asked. And deep down, he had a sinking feeling that this wasn't the end of it. Daniel had felt the weight of the flight attendant's hesitation like an invisible pressure in the air. Even after she had walked away, something about the encounter left a faint unease threading through his thoughts. He turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of Samantha Warren as she moved toward the galley, her shoulders stiff, the rigid lines of her posture betraying a lingering discomfort. She was thinking about them. Sienna, still absorbing the luxury of their seats, took longer to notice the shift in the atmosphere. But Daniel could see it, the way her movements slowed, how the excitement in her eyes dimmed just a little as she replayed the interaction in her mind. That was weird, she murmured, keeping her voice low. But Daniel didn't answer. His fingers tapped idly against the armrest, his gaze steady on the back of the cabin where Samantha had disappeared. He was waiting. And then, minutes later, she returned. She walked with a controlled precision, as though each step was carefully measured. But this time, she wasn't alone. A second flight attendant followed, a man older than her, his salt and pepper hair slicked back, the kind of presence that carried an air of authority without needing to announce it. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. The aisle seemed to narrow as they approached, the quiet hum of conversation between other passengers fading into a distant background noise. A few curious eyes flicked toward them, quick, subtle glances before looking away. Samantha stopped just beside their row. We need you both to step out of first class for a moment, she said, her tone smooth but firm, her expression unreadable. Sienna blinked, confusion knitting her brows. Why? Daniel already knew this wasn't a request. Something about your tickets needs to be verified, the male flight attendant added, his voice carrying a practiced neutrality. It was the kind of tone used to control situations before they escalated. Calm, authoritative, non-negotiable. Daniel sat back slightly, exhaling through his nose. He knew exactly what was happening. You already checked them, he said evenly. Samantha's jaw tensed just slightly. We need to confirm something, she replied, her words carefully chosen. If you could just step aside. Sienna's fingers curled around the armrest. Daniel could feel the tension rolling off her, the way her breath had gone shallow. He didn't blame her. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply sat in their seats. But now they were being asked to leave. Samantha waited. The male attendant beside her remained silent, letting the moment stretch, letting the pressure settle in, as if allowing them a chance to comply before escalation became necessary. Daniel knew exactly how this would look. A refusal would shift the entire narrative. Passengers who had so far remained passive would suddenly find themselves watching a scene. It wouldn't matter that they had done nothing wrong. The only thing people would remember was that they had resisted. So he exhaled slowly, unbuckled his seatbelt, and grabbed his bag. Come on, he said to Sienna, his voice low but steady. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, but when she met his gaze, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding. This wasn't the time to fight. Not yet. Sienna stood, the movement stiff, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag as she slung it over her shoulder. The aisle felt impossibly long as they walked down it, the silence stretching. Daniel was acutely aware of every glance that followed them. A handful of passengers turned their heads, but no one spoke. No one asked what was happening. No one stopped it. The moment they stepped through the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, the heavy door to the jet bridge sealed behind them with an audible click. They were off the plane. The air in the terminal was colder than inside the aircraft, sterile and impersonal. A uniformed security officer stood nearby, arms crossed, his eyes flicking toward them with a look that was neither welcoming nor hostile, just waiting. Sienna let out a sharp breath, the weight of what had just happened crashing over her all at once. This doesn't make sense, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't do anything. Daniel pulled out his phone. His hands were steady, his movements precise. He scrolled through his contacts, found the number he needed, and pressed the call button. The line barely rang twice before their father picked up. Dad, Daniel said, his voice calm, but with an unmistakable edge beneath it. They just kicked us off the plane. There was a pause on the other end. Not confusion, not disbelief, something quieter, colder. Who did? Daniel turned his head slightly, catching sight of Samantha Warren and the other attendant reboarding the plane without a backward glance. The flight crew, he said. Another pause. Then their father's voice, low and measured. Stay where you are. Don't speak to anyone. I'll handle this. The call ended. Daniel lowered the phone, the device suddenly feeling heavier in his grip. He turned his head slightly, watching Sienna. She looked smaller now, her arms crossed over her chest as if trying to fold in on herself. What's Dad going to do? She asked, her voice tight. Daniel inhaled, slow and steady, before shaking his head. I don't know, he admitted, but I don't think they're ready for it. Sienna didn't say anything. She just nodded once, her lips pressed into a thin line. The terminal around them continued to buzz with movement. Flights were still departing, passengers still checking their phones, sipping their coffees, rolling their luggage across polished floors. As if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just been removed from a flight that should have been theirs. But Daniel knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. The moment stretched, heavy, suffocating. The silence in the cabin was louder than any voice. Samantha Warren stood rigid in the aisle, her fingers pressed against her uniform, as if grounding herself in control. The presence of the second flight attendant beside her gave weight to the command that had already been issued. But now there was an added element, an authority that left no room for argument. I'll ask you one more time, Samantha said, her voice smooth, controlled. You need to step off the plane. Sienna's grip on the armrest tightened. Daniel saw the way her shoulders tensed, the rapid rise and fall of her chest. She was waiting for someone, anyone to step in. But no one did. The other passengers remained still, their eyes flickering toward the scene before quickly retreating behind books, phones, or the dull glow of in-flight screens. The quiet betrayal of indifference. A few rows away, a woman flipped the page of a magazine, her gaze carefully avoiding the unfolding confrontation. Across the aisle, a man in a pressed suit sipped his drink, his expression carefully blank. They weren't just watching, they were choosing not to watch. Daniel exhaled slowly. He knew what this was. It wasn't about the tickets. It wasn't about a mistake. It was about control, about how quickly it could be taken away, about how easily power could shift when people believed you didn't belong. And right now, arguing would only make them seem exactly how Samantha wanted them to look. Difficult, uncooperative, a problem that needed to be removed. He made his decision. Come on, Daniel muttered, reaching for his bag. His voice was measured, calculated, a thin thread of steel beneath it. Sienna turned to him, her expression unreadable. But there was something just beneath the surface, something cracking. We didn't do anything, she whispered, her voice small. He knew that. He knew that better than anyone. But this wasn't the time to fight. Before she could protest, before her voice could waver into something Samantha could use against them, Daniel pulled her up gently. The heat of her hesitation pulsed between them, but she followed. As they stepped into the aisle, Samantha took a single step back, making space as if they were something to be cleared away. Thank you for your cooperation, she said. It was the final twist of the knife. The walk toward the exit was longer than it should have been. The air felt thick, the weight of unspoken words pressing against their backs. Every step was a reminder of where they stood, not as first-class passengers, not as equals, but as intruders being escorted out. When they reached the cabin doors, a uniformed security officer was already waiting. His posture was relaxed, but the implication was clear. This wasn't a request anymore. A final glance back. Passengers still avoided their eyes. A few pretended to be asleep. No one moved. No one had ever intended to stop this. Then, with a soft mechanical hiss, the doors sealed behind them. The terminal was colder, not just in temperature, but in presence. It felt vast, indifferent, an empty space where the rules of power had shifted. The distant sounds of boarding announcements filled the silence, the echo of rolling suitcases and quiet conversations, creating a world that continued as if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't just been erased from that flight. Sienna stood still. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her fingers gripping the fabric of her sweater. She wasn't crying, not yet. But Daniel could see it in the way her breath hitched, in the way she pressed her lips together as if holding something back. A few seconds passed before she inhaled sharply, and it happened. A single, quiet sob. She turned away quickly, shoulders hunched, but it was too late. The weight of humiliation had already settled in. Daniel clenched his jaw. He wanted to say something, to fix something, but there was nothing left to fix. Not here, not now. Instead, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for only a second before pressing the familiar number. It barely rang once before the voice answered. "Daniel!" His grip tightened. His voice, when it came, was steady. "Dad," he said, each syllable cutting through the air like steel. A pause. Then Michael Brooks's voice, low, controlled, and dangerous in its quiet restraint. "What happened?" Daniel inhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. "They just pulled us off the plane." The silence on the other end wasn't confusion. It wasn't surprise. It was something colder, calculated. "Where are you now?" Daniel turned his head slightly, glancing at Sienna. She was still turned away, blinking quickly, trying to compose herself. "The terminal," he answered, "near gate 14. Another pause. "Stay there. Don't talk to anyone." The call ended. Daniel lowered the phone, the weight of the conversation settling over him. He didn't know what his father was going to do, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The phone call had ended, but its weight lingered in the air. Daniel lowered the phone from his ear, his grip tight around the edges of the device. He had expected anger, sharp words, maybe even frustration from his father. Instead, there had been nothing. Just that measured silence, that pause where something cold settled in. Then those final words. "Stay there. Don't talk to anyone." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Sienna stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her body stiff with frustration, embarrassment, and something deeper. Something Daniel didn't want to name yet. She had wiped away the single tear that had slipped out earlier, but he knew the damage had already been done. This wasn't just about being forced off the plane. It was about being seen as something less, something that could be dismissed, erased, forgotten. He could still feel the weight of the passengers' eyes, or rather their refusal to look at them at all. He took a slow breath. Sienna shifted slightly. "What did he say?" Daniel exhaled through his nose. "To wait." "That's it?" He nodded. Sienna scoffed under her breath, shaking her head as she turned away. "This is insane," she muttered, voice tight. Daniel didn't respond, because he knew this wasn't insane. This was calculated. And their father? He wasn't the type of man to sit back and let something like this go unnoticed. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Samantha Warren finally exhaled. It was done. The situation had been handled. She could feel the tension unwinding from her shoulders as she moved down the aisle, making subtle eye contact with the other flight attendants. A few of them had given her silent nods of acknowledgement. Not approval exactly, but understanding. She had done what she was supposed to do. She had maintained order. That was all that mattered. With a quick glance toward the cockpit, Samantha adjusted the cuffs of her uniform and made her way back toward the galley. A sense of normalcy was already returning, the passengers slipping back into their routines, as if the disruption had never occurred. As if those two seats had always been empty. Problem solved, or so she thought. 15 minutes later, a quiet warning signal pulsed through the aircraft's communication system. The cockpit phone rang, a direct line. The first officer exchanged a glance with the captain before answering, pressing the receiver to his ear. "Flight 827, he said smoothly. A pause. Then his expression shifted. The captain noticed immediately. "What is it?" The first officer swallowed once before muting the receiver with his palm. "It's corporate," he murmured. The captain's brows furrowed. "Corporate?" The first officer nodded. "We've received a complaint. From above." The weight of those words settled into the cabin like a cold front rolling in. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the engines. Then the captain leaned forward, his voice low. "How far above are we talking?" The first officer hesitated, eyes flicking back to the phone, as if the answer might change in the next second. "Directly from the owner." The temperature in the cockpit seemed to drop. The captain let out a slow breath, straightening in his seat. Patch them through. This was no longer a standard complaint. This was a storm, and it had already begun. The cockpit was unnervingly quiet. Captain Harris leaned forward, his fingers gripping the edge of the control panel as the second call came through. The first had been enough to shift the air in the room, to make him realize that this wasn't just a complaint. It was something far worse. But the second call? The second call was personal. The first officer kept his gaze fixed ahead, hands steady on the controls, but Harris could feel the tension settling in his shoulders. The entire flight crew had felt it, the unspoken knowledge that something was about to change. When the captain pressed the receiver to his ear, he expected the usual corporate pleasantries. A measured voice, a request for clarification, maybe even an executive passing the matter down the chain of command. Instead, the voice on the other end was calm, cold, unforgiving. "This is Michael Brooks." Harris exhaled slowly. He had heard the name before, of course. Everyone in the industry had. But this was the first time it had been directed at him personally. He sat up straighter, his voice instinctively smoothing into something more professional. "Mr. Brooks, this is Captain Harris. How can I? You just removed my children from my airline's flight." A pause. No yelling, no immediate accusations, just fact. Harris's stomach turned. There were very few things that could shake the power dynamic of a plane in midair, but this was one of them. His mind raced through possible responses, damage control measures, anything that could soften what had already happened. "Sir, I can assure you—" "You're not going to assure me of anything," Michael interrupted. "I want to speak to the flight attendant responsible. Now." Harris hesitated, eyes flicking to his first officer, who had gone completely still. There was no protocol for this. None. He reached for the intercom instead. The first-class cabin had settled back into routine. Samantha Warren was tidying up a tray, her thoughts already drifting toward landing preparations. She had handled the situation. The problem was gone. Everything was fine, until her earpiece crackled to life. "Miss Warren, report to the cockpit immediately." Her brow furrowed slightly. That was, unusual. There was no urgency in the tone. No explanation, just a call. She exchanged a glance with another flight attendant before setting down the tray and smoothing the front of her uniform. And then, with the same confidence she had held all flight, she strode toward the front. The moment she stepped into the cockpit, she realized something was wrong. Captain Harris didn't look at her immediately. The first officer didn't look at her at all. The atmosphere had changed. Something heavy sat between them, something unspoken but suffocating. Samantha frowned. "Captain?" Harris exhaled, then finally turned toward her. "You just removed 2 passengers from first class," he said evenly. Samantha barely reacted. "Yes," she said smoothly. "I had concerns about the validity of their seating arrangements, and you just removed the owner's children from the plane." A single sentence. No inflection, no emphasis. Just truth. Samantha's breath caught for the briefest second. Then she blinked. Her entire body went still. The silence stretched, unbearable, suffocating. Harris watched her carefully, measuring her reaction, waiting for something, anything, that would indicate she understood what had just happened. But Samantha Warren had spent years perfecting control. She took a slow breath, adjusting her posture, and forced her voice to remain neutral. I wasn't aware." Harris didn't blink. That much is obvious. A flicker of something crossed her face, something tight. But she wasn't panicking. Not yet. She was calculating. "I was following protocol," she said. "The seating looked—" "You didn't verify before making that decision?" Samantha's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out, because there was no good answer. Harris exhaled through his nose, pressing his fingers against his temple before speaking again. "You're going to fix this," he said simply, "right now." And then, before she could even breathe, he pressed a button on the intercom. "Attention, flight crew, prepare to return 2 passengers to their assigned first-class seats." Samantha's heart stopped. Back in the terminal, Daniel's phone buzzed. He barely had time to process the words on the screen before showing it to Sienna. "Wait near the gate. You're being brought back on board. Sienna's eyes widened slightly. Daniel felt something shift inside him, something irreversible. This wasn't just an apology, this was a reckoning. And for the first time since they had stepped off that plane, it was no longer their problem, it was hers. The walk back onto the plane felt heavier than before. Daniel and Sienna stepped onto the jet bridge. The familiar scent of recycled air and faint traces of cologne from the first-class cabin washing over them. But the atmosphere was different now, charged, expectant. Every step they took felt measured, controlled. Not their own choice, but something imposed upon them by the weight of the moment. They weren't just passengers anymore. They were the center of everyone's attention. The moment they crossed the threshold into the cabin, a strange hush settled over the space. The usual hum of quiet conversations, the rustle of newspapers, and the soft chime of in-flight announcements had been replaced with something heavier. Eyes, dozens of them. Passengers who had turned away when they were removed now watched them return. Some looked surprised, some ashamed. Others carefully avoided their gaze, staring blankly ahead as if pretending not to notice what was happening. But they noticed. Everyone noticed. Daniel's fingers curled slightly as they moved forward, not rushing, not hesitating. A silent statement in every step. And then just as they neared their seats, a voice broke through the silence. "Welcome back, Mr. Brooks, Miss Brooks." Captain Harris's voice carried through the intercom, steady and firm. "There was a mistake made today by members of our flight crew. These passengers were wrongly removed from their assigned seats. On behalf of the airline, we sincerely apologize." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Daniel inhaled slowly. It wasn't the apology itself that mattered. It was who had to give it. They hadn't been wrong. And now, everyone knew it. Sienna slid into her seat first, her fingers gripping the armrests as if grounding herself. Daniel followed, moving deliberately, adjusting his seatbelt with a slow, calculated movement. And then came her, Samantha Warren. She approached their row with practiced control, the rigidness in her posture betraying the fact that every fiber of her being resisted this moment. She stopped just beside them, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. Her breath was even, but Daniel could see the tension in the way her fingers curled slightly, digging into her own palm as if willing herself to remain composed. Sienna didn't look at her. Daniel did. She cleared her throat once, forcing her voice into something smooth, controlled. "There was a misunderstanding," she said, tone carefully neutral. Sienna's fingers curled against the seatbelt. Daniel tilted his head slightly, the smallest movement. Then after a pause, he finally spoke. "No." A flicker, the briefest hesitation in Samantha's expression. He turned his head fully, meeting her gaze with something cold, steady, undeniable. "You didn't misunderstand anything," he continued, his voice quiet but unwavering. "You just didn't want us here." A sharp silence stretched between them. Samantha's lips parted slightly, as if preparing to respond, to argue, to justify. But no words came out, because there was nothing to say. She had made a choice. And now she had to sit in it. The cabin, once filled with quiet indifference, now buzzed with something else entirely. Whispers. They rippled through first class like an incoming tide, growing louder, more distinct, impossible to ignore. Samantha Warren felt them before she heard them. The shift in energy, the way people turned their heads, not just to observe, but to judge. It was her they were watching now. Not the Brooks siblings, her. She had controlled the situation before, dictated how it played out. But now she was the one under scrutiny. She stood frozen beside their row, her hands still clasped neatly in front of her. But the rigidness in her fingers betrayed the truth. This was slipping away from her. A murmur rose from somewhere behind her. "A mistake, huh?" someone muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Looked pretty intentional from where I was sitting." A hushed agreement followed. Another voice. "Honestly, the way she asked them to move, I knew something was off." Samantha felt her pulse in her throat. She turned slightly, scanning the faces around her. Some were pretending to be occupied, their gazes flickering toward her before darting away. Others? Others watched her without shame now, as if waiting for something, for her to acknowledge it, for her to admit it. A sharp voice cut through the murmurs. Would have taken 2 seconds to check their tickets properly. A beat, then another voice. She didn't even try. The realization crept in slowly, suffocatingly, for the first time in years, maybe ever. Samantha wasn't in control. She swallowed, trying to school her features into something neutral, professional, controlled. But she wasn't fooling anyone. And then Daniel spoke. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough. Say it! Samantha's stomach dropped. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. You thought we didn't belong here. Just say it. Silence. Thick. Oppressive. Sienna sat beside him, her hands still gripping the seatbelt, her face unreadable. But her knuckles were white. Samantha's jaw tightened slightly. Her breath was even, measured. She could fix this. But could she? Daniel's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't just asking a question. He was demanding accountability. Samantha turned her head slightly. The captain was watching. Captain Harris, arms crossed over his chest, standing just a few feet away, his presence towering over the situation like an unmovable force. And then he nodded, a silent command. Samantha felt it like a noose tightening around her throat. There was no way out of this. She had spent years training for pressure, for moments of confrontation. But not this. Not when the entire cabin was waiting, not when her own crew was waiting, and certainly not when she already knew the answer. She forced a slow breath through her nose. Then, for the first time since she had ordered them off the plane, she met Daniel's gaze head-on. Her voice, when it came, was measured. I made an assumption, she said carefully. And I was wrong. A pause, but Daniel didn't let it go. An assumption about what? Samantha felt the weight of every single passenger's gaze pressing into her. A sharp breath. Then finally, you didn't look like you belonged in first class. The words landed like a gavel strike. And for the first time, Samantha Warren knew what it felt like to be on the other side of a judgment she couldn't escape. The silence that followed Samantha's admission was thick, suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. For a fleeting moment, the entire cabin froze, as if absorbing the weight of what had just been said. And then, a shift. It wasn't loud, no gasps, no dramatic reactions. Just the quiet, undeniable acknowledgement of truth settling in the air like an unshakable presence. A truth that couldn't be ignored. A truth that Samantha Warren had been forced to say out loud, not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. She felt the judgment now, not from Daniel, not even from Sienna, from everyone. Passengers who had pretended not to notice before were now watching her with something different in their eyes. Not just disappointment, recognition, because in that moment they all knew. They knew what this had been. They knew what had really happened. And Samantha? She knew too. But it wasn't over yet. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression still unreadable. Not gloating, not triumphant. Just calm. And then, you still haven't apologized. Samantha flinched. Her throat felt tight, her breath coming too slow, too measured, like she was trying to maintain control when she already knew it was slipping through her fingers. But she wasn't in control. Not anymore. She exhaled slowly, her voice quieter this time. I made an assumption, she said again, the words like lead in her mouth. And I was wrong. Daniel didn't break eye contact. You're not apologizing, he said evenly. You're just scared of the consequences. Samantha felt her breath catch. Because he was right. She had spent years handling difficult passengers, smoothing over conflicts, maintaining order in the cabin with unquestioned authority. But this wasn't a conflict she could control. This was a reckoning, and she had no defense. She swallowed hard, her posture stiff, as if bracing herself for a turbulence she hadn't anticipated. But the turbulence wasn't in the air. It was here, right in front of her, and for the first time in her career, she was the one waiting for permission to walk away. But permission wouldn't come. Instead, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Harris's voice was smooth, controlled, but there was something unmistakably deliberate in his tone. We will be landing shortly, and upon arrival, all flight attendants should remain in their designated positions. A pause. And Samantha Warren, please report to the cockpit upon landing. The final blow. A ripple of realization moved through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances. Some looked at her, some looked at the Brooks siblings. Most just knew. This was more than a correction. This was a decision. Samantha went rigid, her nails pressing into her palm, the way they had when she stood in front of Daniel and Sienna, pretending she still had power. She didn't. Not anymore. Daniel turned away first, not dismissively, not cruelly, just done. And Sienna? She finally let go of the seatbelt she had been gripping so tightly, not because she was comfortable, but because she didn't have to fight anymore. The battle was already won. The descent was smooth. The landing, even smoother. But for Samantha Warren, the moment those wheels touched the ground, her world had already shifted. Passengers stood, gathering their belongings, stretching after the long flight. But Samantha, she didn't move. She couldn't, because she knew what was waiting for her at the front of the plane. Daniel and Sienna stepped off the jet bridge, not looking back. And standing there just beyond the gate, waiting, was Michael Brooks. His expression was unreadable, but Samantha didn't have to see it to know. Her fate was already sealed.